Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Tamara Nair, and I'm a Senior Associate Fellow here at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University. Welcome to our webinar series on 25 years of Women, Peace and Security Agenda in the Indo-Pacific region. Good afternoon to my Singaporean participants and those of you who are joining us from other parts of the world. A very good day to you. Before we get into the speakers, just very briefly, an introduction. So, since the passing of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security on 31st October the year 2000, the WPS agenda has been gaining traction in the Indo-Pacific region. The agenda is the most highly recognized significant global framework for addressing gender equality in military affairs, conflict resolution, and security governance. WPS has its provenance in the conflicts in the 1990s, but it is also essentially rooted in human security. This year, 2025, marks the 25th year of the WPS agenda globally, and of course in the Indo-Pacific region. Now the region faces new and evolving threats to the security of women in new spaces, but unfortunately at the same time dragging along with it all threats to that one group, despite forming 50% of the global population, is unfortunately still often considered a minority interest in security planning. Now, given the maturity of the agenda, it now seems poised to take on these new challenges facing women, from harassment, from exclusion, and sometimes from downright threat to life in new spaces and new challenges that women face. The 25th anniversary milestone prompts us towards regional reflections on the progress, gaps, and future direction of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And there are some underlying themes and challenges that inspire this. For example, with increasing resistance to progressive language at the international level and international organizations, there is a call to strengthen existing instruments and resolutions rather than pushing for new ones. With the rising global backlash against inclusivity, gender equality, and feminist peace building, there is a need to continue conversations and build on the good work done thus far. And of course, with emerging security threats such as climate change, the impacts of climate change, and violence against women in the digital space, there is urgency for greater inclusive participation to address these massive challenges to humanity. The Indo-Pacific experience of WPS, in particular that of ASEAN, is rather noteworthy. In ASEAN, there has been increasing calls for greater participation from women in almost all areas concerning peace building and developing safe and cohesive societies. As a matter of fact, ASEAN, in fact, has the potential to lead the WPS agenda in this time where the value of the agenda is seemingly being slowly eroded elsewhere. October 31st is recognized as the official start of UNSC 1325, and a decision was made to have this webinar series to run in tandem with similar activities happening in the UN and elsewhere around the world commemorating the anniversary. So this webinar is actually jointly convened by RSIS as well as UN Women, and I will be your moderator for this particular session. The series itself, the webinar series, has two aims. Firstly, to take stock of all the good work done by states, CSOs, other non-state actors, and regional governments in implementing the 4 pillars of WPS, basically protection, prevention, participation, and women's role in relief and recovery in the Indo-Pacific region. The other aim that we have is to discuss emerging security threats in the region with a particular focus on its impact on women and girls, and of course, highlighting the best practices of both state and non-state actors to combat these challenges. So with that said, I think that's enough for me. We will soon start our presentations. We have 4 very noteworthy and stellar presenters with us today. Firstly, we have Ms. Nurul Muhammad Rashid from policy. Oh, by the way, I will introduce them in the order that they will be presenting. We have Ms. Nurul Muhammad Rashid, Policy Advisor from UN Women on Governance, Peace and Security in the Asia-Pacific region. She's based in Bangkok. After that, we will have Dr. Sumita Basu, Associate Professor of International Relations, South Asian University, New Delhi. Ms. Amina Russell Bernardo will follow. She is the president of the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy. And finally, we have Ms. Pei Xuan Xie from she's a humanitarian affairs analyst from Médecins Sans Frontières, and she will close our webinar presentation for today. Just a quick reminder to our speakers that you each have 15 minutes for your interventions, after which, when we conclude all the 4 presentations, we will take questions from the participants. Participants, you are also reminded to kindly keep your questions short so we can take as many questions as possible because we have very little time. And please let me know who you would like to take your questions, or who your question is directed to, or whether you would like the whole panel to address your queries. With that said, let us very quickly get started with our webinar, and I would now like to invite Ms. Nurul to start us off, please. Nurul, if you please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon from Bangkok. A very big thank you, of course, to S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore, for this kind invitation. It is indeed a privilege for me to be speaking alongside fellow panelists such as Sumita, Amina, Peshon, and of course you, Tamara. So before I begin, firstly, in light of recent developments in Thailand, UN Women wishes to express deep sympathy at the passing of Her Majesty Queen Sirikit. She's the Queen Mother of Thailand, and we joined the United Nations here in Thailand to extend deepest condolences to the royal family and to the people of Thailand during this time of national mourning. So tomorrow, to come back to the topic at hand, what I'll do is that I will provide a brief overview of global trends, including from the UN Secretary General's recent report on women, peace, and security, reflecting sort of trends that are common really in all the regions that were examined in the report, including in the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific region. If you could show the first slide. What is consistent is that over the past 25 years, member states and women peace builders, women networks have indeed driven progress on the women peace and security agenda. They have advanced, change. They have shaped the discourse, and they have been fostering peace where it was most needed in all parts of the world. It is increasingly understood, as we have pointed out tomorrow, that the agenda has indeed evolved and proven to be an effective framework for inclusive approaches to what we call non-traditional or emerging peace and security issues that were not, in fact, explored deeply in the 10 Security Council resolutions making up the WPS agenda, such as climate change, cybersecurity, and other sort of transborder security challenges. If we were to summarize the past 25 years in sort of the simplest way, it would be modest progress in the previous 20 years, and especially in the second decade of implementation, followed by stagnation and sometimes even regression in the past 5 years. As the difficult international context has hurt most of the policy agenda promoted by the United Nations and member states. Now, rising authoritarianism, proliferation of conflict and militarization, shrinking civic space, decreasing compliance with international norm has made the world much less safe, and it is hurting women and girls the most. But I would also add that across all 25 years, we have seen a common pattern of rhetorical support for the agenda accompanied by very weak implementation across the board. Even before things got worse, we never did change the face of decision-making on war and peace or the composition of peace tables. If you look at slide 2, the second slide, I'll just give you a summary of sort of the global context in 2024. Here you can see that everything has gone up, right? So you can see a sharp increase in conflicts and war, 61 armed conflicts at the last count in 2024, a record high number of women and girls living in proximity to conflict, 676 million, surging global military expenditure, 2.7 trillion being spent, is really the steepest year-on-year rise since the end of the Cold War. And the number of people uprooted by war is really at very high levels as well, 122 million. In slide number 3, in the next slide, you can see that, yes, we are now facing the highest number of active conflicts since 1946. And that has created, of course, unprecedented risks for women and girls. And yet in 2024, we still have very low numbers of inclusive peace processes. 7% of negotiators, 14% of mediators, and 20% of signatories were women. Many conflicts are now negotiated in what we call in closed and exclusive formats without a comprehensive peace agreement reached. Comprehensive peace agreements really are those that would include very diverse perspectives, including gender provisions and gender perspectives as well. I also want to highlight that recent funding cuts that we are all aware of to the United Nations and to the UN work, but also to women's organizations, are an existential threat to women-led and women's rights organizations on the front lines of today's conflicts and humanitarian crisis. According to UN Women Global Survey, about 90% of women's organizations in 44 crisis-affected countries reported being impacted by foreign aid cuts. Over 60% have already reduced critical services, including gender-based violence responses, maternal health, and economic support. The Women, Peace, and Humanitarian Fund, which basically funds women's organizations, did a survey last year and found that 46% of civil society organizations feel at high risk of closure, highlighting the urgent need for long-term flexible co-funding. And a new UN Women report called At Risk and Underfunded, based on a global survey of 428 women's rights and civil society groups, find that 1 in 3 have either suspended or shut down programs aimed at ending gender-based violence. Now, last year, we also spoke of 2024 as the year of elections, even here in the Asia-Pacific region, right? But progress in terms of women's political leadership was indeed quite minimal. We now know that 102 countries never had a women leader ever, and only 29 countries right now have a women leader. About 25% of parliamentarians globally are women, and only 21% of cabinet ministers are women as well. So indeed, that's sort of a brief overview of where we are in terms of women's leadership in peace and political processes. But we are seeing positive developments, and I will speak a little bit more to that. I don't know, Tamara, whether you want me to continue or speak to it a little bit later.
Oh, you can go ahead. You can continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so UN Women directly support government and civil society, and the multi-stakeholder convenings that happen during consultations and discussions on WPS National Action Plan has been quite remarkable. In a few countries, for example, civil society organizations informed us that it was the first time that they had direct sort of discussions on peace and security with government. So the convenings that we do also brings agencies in the government that undertake the 4-pillar work, such as police, for example, on protection, women and gender affairs, on participation, environment, climate, on prevention, and disaster relief agencies, looking at relief and recovery pillar. And many national action plans in this region, the National Action Plan framing that you can find in this region, they do reflect the 4-pillar approach, which generally indicates a more comprehensive and careful analysis of prevailing issues, but also highlighting areas where women's participation and leadership are indeed lacking. We've also been testing the whole of society and human security approaches to peace and security, and that is an essential part of the WPS framework, and there's room to do more in the Asia-Pacific region. For example, our work in supporting member states on cybersecurity moves away from a more state technocratic approach that focuses on usually protecting critical infrastructure to a more gendered, people-centered, human security approach, focusing on online harms, hate speech, disinformation, misinformation, that would have an impact on personal and community security. But that also exposes, misogynistic online movements that are organized and effective and contributing to the global pushback on women's rights and gender equality, as well as displaying, what we now know as toxic masculinities in the online space. And so that approach is sort of more or less consistent with the 4-pillar approach. And there are promising practices that we see by both government and civil society, such as Australia's and Fiji's E-Commission that offers training on violence against women in politics, and NGOs such as She Singapore that offers support to those impacted by online harms. UN Women is also providing cyber resilience training to women peace builders and rights defenders, and we offer a digital security e-learning platform in 10 languages. They're free for everyone, and I can share with you the link to that e-learning platform as well. On inclusive participation, we are seeing more states looking to include participation or leadership of women peace builders with disabilities, for example. They're focusing more on ability and not disability, right? Organizations that represent women with disabilities are more organized and contributing unique perspectives and solutions to peace and security discussions. So I want to give a shout out to the good work done by the Southeast Asia and the Pacific Disability Forum. They offer expertise, they produce studies and guidance to inform policies and programs. I also want to highlight the national action plans, such as Philippines, which is quite exemplary in its recognition of the contributions and rights of diverse communities, and others from Australia, Bangladesh, Japan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Timor-Leste. Big congratulations to Timor-Leste, right, for being an ASEAN member state. And so these countries have incorporated intersectional perspective to national action plans, for example, looking at socioeconomic status, age, ethnicity, disability, indigenous status, or gender identities. I also want to highlight the good work that's been done on climate, peace, and security, particularly by young men and women. We should really be spotlighting women's organization and peace builder solutions and contributions, including from youth-led climate action to mediation efforts. We have, very young people from Balochistan, Pakistan, for example, that are leading projects, setting up the first climate camp, putting emphasis on training, resilience building, and sort of just giving a much broader platform to women and communities who are affected as well. I want to also speak a little bit about what's going on in the ASEAN region. Really good things going on in ASEAN region. So there are currently about 13 active national action plans on women, peace, and security in Asia and the Pacific, with 2 sub-regional plans in the BARM region in the Philippines and the autonomous region of Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. One of the key milestones was the adoption of the ASEAN Regional Plan of Action in 2022. And what this has done is really to inspire localization efforts in some of these countries that you see on the next slide. So on the next slide, you can see that there are a number of countries that have national action plans. Cambodia and Thailand are developing theirs. This clearly demonstrates how ASEAN's regional commitments are being localized and how women CSOs and governments can effectively collaborate together to focus on finding solutions as well. In the next slide, I think there are a number of other success stories. ASEAN is creating a community of practice. It is intended to be a multi-stakeholder platform, bringing together ASEAN sectoral bodies, security sector, government, civil society, and media. So hopefully it will be actively used to enhance collaboration, knowledge sharing, and expand the space for civil society to dialogue and engage with ASEAN member state and institutions. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've done my 15 minutes, but I'll be more than happy to speak more at the Q&A. Thank you very much, Tamara. Back to you.
Thank you, Nurul. Thank you for your presentation across, especially the one on ASEAN and all the hope there is in terms of, pushing the WPS agenda forward. Next, we have Dr. Sumita Basu to take us to SAARC experience and India in particular. Sumita, will you please?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. And yes, thank you, Tamara and team, for organizing this important conversation. I think this year has been marked by a series of anniversary events, and it really doesn't get old because each has its own contribution to make to the larger discussion around the future of the WPS agenda. While the slides come up, yes, I just wanted to say that I'm very honored to be part of this distinguished panel. And my brief specifically, as Tamara mentioned, is to focus on WPS in South Asia with an additional sort of zooming in on India. But I'll begin, as advised, with a more general assessment of the WPS agenda. But thank you, Ms. Rashid, for that very, very comprehensive presentation. It certainly makes, it provides a very, very valuable springboard for taking the discussion forward. So in the next slide, I have just set out the outline for my presentation. So it's divided into three parts. In the first one, a very broad assessment of 1325. Second, looking at WPS in South Asia, and very briefly India and WPS, and all of these draw on some recent publications. So in the next slide, I propose that we think about 1325 as a tool. And this is not a new idea. In fact, I've cited here this co-authored, it was an interview between, it was a conversation between scholars, Carol Cohn, Helen Kinsella, and Sherry Gibbings, with some of those who were involved in the original drafting of Resolution 1325, advocates like Mahamuna, Aisha Daifan, and so on. So initially, when we think of 1325 as a tool, we see these two opposing ideas. So Carol Cohn says, for instance, that this is very helpful for advocacy, for taking forward feminist peace. The quote is right there, while Gibbings cautions us that it can be used also for military occupation. And we have seen both of this use of 1325 and the WPS agenda more broadly play out. I think as far as the first aspect is concerned, Ms. Rashid's presentation covered a lot of this, including some of the recent developments. Unfortunately, we also have it being used as a tool, as a sort of interventionist for interventions in some of the weaker parts of the world. And I've deliberately used this picture of women protesters from Afghanistan, and WPS had a very particular experience in Afghanistan, of course. So in the next 2 minutes, I just want to talk about 1325 as a policy mechanism being used as a tool in the last 25 years, specifically in the next slide, as I clarified, by governments and non-governmental organizations, and of course, international organizations, including the UN. So in principle, of course, and this is something that was clarified in the initial debates, that 1325 is going to be very valuable because It was going to ensure sustainable peace and security. And over the years, research has also shown that attention to gender equality, having more women as signatories to peace agreements, is going to bring us more durable peace. However, as scholarly research has shown, very often governments have engaged with it more for relatively narrower interests, like and invested in those aspects of 1325, which has been useful for taking their agenda forward. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. So for example, towards the end, I'll discuss how India has used 1325 for in its work on peacekeeping. And that's great because it has brought more attention to issues, gender-related issues in peacekeeping, but it has also been used for narrower interests in terms of, I think Mr. forthcoming. For civil society was very much
Sorry,
seen.
Samita, I think we just lost you there for like a couple of seconds. Could you just maybe? Yes.
I'm sorry about that.
No
Am
worries.
I clear now?
Yes.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I will not maybe repeat myself too much. Just to say that 1325 is important for governments because, and it's important for maintenance of international peace and security because research shows that it is good for bringing in durable peace. Gender equality is great for that. But in practice, we have had states use it for relatively narrower interests. For civil society, this was a very 1325 and the other resolutions and the entire policy framework that emerged around 1325. It was great for pushing forward feminist peace. And Felicity Ruby has talked about multiple ways in which it works as a tool, which is mentioned on the slide. But unfortunately, in practice, and I don't know if it's my identity as an academic, that we do bring the darker side of implementation as well, in that it has created hierarchies between sort of in terms of more dominant interpretations of 1325 and the WPS agenda gaining traction. And sometimes, and we've seen certainly in the South Asian case, in the development of NAPs as well to some extent, that some of the localization has not been as effective. Moving on to the next slide. And this is, I won't go through all the details there, but it really looks like 25 years later, 1325 looks like a bit of a battered tool because it has been used and misused so much. And there is exploration. Critics also point out, well, there could be other mechanisms, but I've been of the firm belief right from the beginning that WPS is extremely important because it connects the agenda for gender equality and women's empowerment to the mandate of the UN Security Council. And that's extremely important. And for all its issues, all its problems, the attention, resources, and legitimacy that it brings to the idea of gender peace and security, it remains very, very relevant. With that very broad assessment, I'll now move on to discuss WPS in South Asia. So here, I want to focus on three aspects, and then I'll develop it further with regard to one particular pillar, which is the protection pillar. So the first thing to point out here is South Asia, as we all know, is home to political violence and armed conflict, which in recent months we also saw in the escalation of conflict between India and Pakistan. But simultaneously, there's a long history of peace building at the regional level. And 1325, the international advocacy for 1325 was also informed by South Asian women's experiences of armed conflict. So South Asian feminist peace advocates sort of own 1325 along with feminist peace advocates from across the world. However, in terms of its implementation, there are differences within the countries because the nature of conflicts is also different, and between the countries and within each of these countries. And some of this is also which is what I refer to as positional differences on WPS, on the WPS agenda. And it's reflected to begin with, in the 4 national action plans. Nepal was one of the first, well, it was the second country in Asia after Philippines to adopt a national action plan, and has and has a second national action plan as well. Afghanistan adopted its national action plan in 2015. Bangladesh and Sri Lanka are more recent additions. But I would say that except for Afghanistan, in all the other cases, the civil society played a very important role. And of course, they did so. The national action plans were developed in collaboration with UN Women, and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, of course, received support respectively from governments of Norway and Japan. Just a very broad overview, we find very interesting innovations in these innovative ideas in national action plans. The first one by the Nepalese NAP in 2011, for instance, talked about conflict-affected widows as one of the 14 categories of conflict-affected women. And this category was, in fact, then included in the Sri Lanka National Action Plan. And considering that there is prevalence of widows in conflict-affected or countries, states that are emerging from conflicts, this particular category to recognize the specific experiences of widows was very, very important. And as far as the particular experience, I'll just use this quote by Meenakshi Gopinath and Rita Manchanda to talk about South Asian engagement with 1325, where essentially they point out that the localization, because there's been a long history of feminist peace work as well, that 1325 has become by the women peacemakers, it has really been localized in that. Can we move to the next slide? If we look at the protection pillar as well, it's conceptualized as something more than conflict-related sexual violence. In terms of policies, we see in the National Action Plan that it's related to both national and international legislation. The Bangladesh National Action Plan, for instance, also relates to disaster response as well as experiences of migrant women. And overall, in South Asia, there is a sense that we need to take structural aspects into account. So the point that Tamara was making earlier about relating 1325 also to human security aspects. So there is a very strong recognition of that in the South Asian context. In the next slide, I talk about how the pillars are in fact interconnected. So there's the examples of Bangladeshi and Indian female peacekeepers. And in both, so on the one hand, of course, India and Bangladesh, we can say, have contributed a lot to the participation pillar by contributing female uniformed personnel to UN peacekeeping. And India and both countries have sent very large contingents of these peacekeepers, but their involvement has also then had a positive influence on the protection pillar of the WPS agenda. Finally, in the next 2 minutes, in the final slide, I want to highlight India's engagement with WPS. As far as domestic implementation is concerned, the government's position has been that 1325 is not applicable in the domestic context because officially there are no armed conflicts in the country. Regions where there is political violence, the Ministry of Home Affairs refers to these as disturbed areas. So technically it doesn't seemingly doesn't come under the ambit of the WPS agenda. What I have always found more interesting, in fact, is the civil society has been very ambivalent as well. In India, there hasn't been a strong push towards, for instance, the WPS National Action Plan. And WPS agenda has been considered as part of the larger feminist peace movement. So it's not dominated as much as it has in many other countries within South Asia and indeed in other parts of the world. As far as international implementation is concerned, the government's position has evolved in that initially it was hesitant, but in the Security Council, especially, it has focused on peacekeeping and counterterrorism. And I have more examples of this, which I can talk about, bring up during the interaction. But it has made financial donations as well, and the picture there is of the female peacekeepers at the UN mission in Liberia with President Sirleaf in the foreground. The civil society again remains part, even though they haven't pushed for WPS implementation as much. In those terms, within the country, they remain part of the transnational networks, both regional and global. In that WPS continues to feature in larger conversations, though CEDAW and the Indian Constitution itself is always, and the Beijing Platform for Action has been part of the discussion. I will just say one quick thing, which is something I noticed as I was preparing for this presentation, that in a recent publication by Udrat and Brown, they actually talk about the possibility of a WPS treaty, so bring WPS conversations into the General Assembly, because the success in the Security Council has been limited. And I was reminded of what some of the South Asian feminists said initially, that they would have preferred a General Assembly resolution, a General Assembly instrument instead of a Security Council one. Again, it's a curious thing, and seems like we're coming, that's as one type of a full circle that we might be coming to. But I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samita, especially for talking about the human security aspect of WPS in South Asia. And, it'll be very interesting to see when you talk about the civil society in India, and especially in India, where they're very strong in terms of like pushing for gender equality and gender rights, but not so much for WPS. So, we can talk about that in the Q&A. So next we have Ms. Amina Russell Bernardo or should I say Dr. Amina Russell Bernardo? Did I? Not sure, sorry. Amina, if you could take us through your presentation, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me, Tamara. I really look forward to the conversation that we're going to have. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah. Now, we take pride, Filipinos always take pride that we are the first in Asia, I think, to adopt a national action plan on women, peace, and security. This was in 2010, showing strong national commitment to gender-responsive peace building. Of course, it helped a lot. The peace advisor, the presidential peace advisor at the time, was Ging. The Philippines is now on its fourth generation plan, the National Action Plan for 2023 to 2033. And it continues to refine its approach based on lessons that have been learned from more than a decade of practice, as well as what we're doing in the still remaining areas of conflict in the Philippines. The plan is deeply grounded in the Mindanao peace process that has resulted in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region for Muslim Mindanao. This autonomous region is the product of the peace agreement between government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And in that negotiation, women and civil society did have a strong role to play. Not only were women at the negotiating tables, government panel was headed by a female, that was Professor Miriam Coronel Ferrer. Government committees always had women in the negotiations, and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, with urgings and lobbying from women, especially from the civil society, started to include women, not officially, to consultations that had women in them. So,
Sorry, Amina, sorry, you were cut off briefly, so perhaps just the sentence before, because we lost you for a bit.
well, anyway, as I was saying, the National Action Plan really was developed with a lot of inputs from the successes and, I guess, problems that we've had with the Mindanao peace processes. And I really do believe that the Philippine experience offers valuable lessons, not just on achieving a peace agreement, but really on sustaining the WPS agenda amid political transitions, political problems, ensuring continuity and local ownership through institutional reforms. Now, we had a forum, the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy organized a forum on October 22. And we did this with Academe. There is an association in the Philippines of women's study centers all over the country. And we assessed the implementation of our NAP WPS after 25 years. So I thought today I would share with you not just the accomplishments of my government's NAP WPS, but really to look at the gaps and challenges of our implementation, and share also some reflections about WPS in our region. Next, please. Now, briefly on the Philippine NAP, it has really evolved into a mature and adaptive policy framework, one that increasingly values collaboration, localization involving local governments and local communities, and innovation. However, sustaining its transformative impact will require policy continuity. And, in our democratic system, that's not always a sure thing. It requires dedicated financing. It includes intersectional inclusion and monitoring and evaluation. And our Philippine experience over the last 15 years have generated institutional integration. For instance, we have this. The one soft area that we really need to work on, for instance, is the security sector itself. We have seen local ownership, especially in Muslim Mindanao. Muslim Mindanao, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, now has its own regional plan of action on WPS. And this was the initiative of the Bangsamoro Women's Commission and has been supported by the assembly, the Bangsamoro Transition Authority. And what they're trying to do now is to really link with local governments to make sure that we do have implementation of parts of the plan, if not all of it. And another area, and we're talking about the broadened security lens, NAP WPS in the Philippines has been already taking stock of non-traditional security threats, which is a major value added for the NAP. What makes this NAP now more, well, actually stronger, is the fact that it now has an enhanced meal framework. It has a monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning system. And they have been doing this in consultation with the local governments, local agencies, and civil society. As well, we have survivor-centered protection, expanded community-based protection and justice systems that link formal mechanisms with culturally sensitive and trauma-informed approaches. So the attempt is continuing to improve access to justice in conflict-affected and indigenous areas. Next, please. So let me now share with you the meat of the October 22 forum, which was really to look at where do we improve. We still have armed conflicts in the Philippines. We have sporadic conflicts in the Muslim South, and all over the country, we still have the uncertainty with the Communist Party of the Philippines armed group, the New People's Army, because the peace talks with them has been up, has had its ups and downs, and it's still pending. Plus, of course, there are the non-traditional security threats that we really have to prepare for. So we need to strengthen our NAP-WPS. And in our October 22 forum, we did bring out observations and recommendations. Now, among the observations about gaps and challenges, first, there's really uneven implementation. There are what you call islands of excellence. In the Bangsamoro region, for instance, we do have much better implementation of the NAP-WPS because the women there have been working at being included in the peace process and in peace strategies for decades now. So we see strong initiatives scattered across specific institutions and areas, and we need to sort of rationalize this and bring them together, and that has got to be embedded in the NAP implementation. We still see inadequate and fragmented financing. Funding for WPS remains fragmented and often, in the Philippine case, absorbed under the gender and development allocation. In the Philippines, we have a law that requires all government agencies to set aside, I think 10% of its budget for gender and development. And in some areas, like in Muslim Mindanao, they try and get this GAD allocation to support WPS programs. Apart from that, when we look at the monitoring and evaluation programs, and we look at what they're actually monitoring, it's really focused on activities and not outcomes. So again, this has got to be strengthened in the implementation of the NAP WPS. Let's stop counting activities and how many participants went to a seminar and see what has happened after the training. Let's see. And then you have got the gaps, intersectionality gaps. We see that in marginalized groups, indigenous, Muslim, rural, even the LGBTQ, women with disabilities, their voices are often still absent from policy making and resource distribution at the provincial level. At the national level, there is more a focus on inclusion. But when you go down, there's still a lot to be done, especially Nurul mentioned earlier about the rise of authoritarianism. And in Muslim Mindanao, we do see the influence of rising authoritarianism. Now, when we look at disasters, and we've had a series of disasters in the Philippines, we see the fragility of our communities. We do need to have a more responsive disaster response mechanism by national government. What we have seen, for instance, in camps, the IDP camps, WPS is not really that apparent. So we see a lot of violence against women in these camps. You see cases of sexual abuse in these camps. So again, that is an area that needs improvement. Now, could I have the next slide, please? Policy continuity. Our military, our security sector takes pride in the fact that they have started to embed WPS in their programs and their policy. However, when we look at the integration, again, these are like islands and very, very small islands at that. It is not truly embedded in the policies. If you look at the leadership, for instance, of the security sector, it's all male. And that has got to change if they mean what they say, that they do have policy continuity. Next, please. Now, we at the PCID have been working on WPS for about 10 years now, and I will just share with you two initiatives that we've started, which I think might be of use to other regions as well. Next, please. Okay. What we have done, we started looking at who have influential voices in our communities. And it turns out it's the religious. And among the religious, there are many women who teach in the madrasas, who run the madrasas. So we started providing a network for them. And we call this the Nurus Salam. And they're autonomous now. They work quite well in several of our communities. And we would like to suggest strongly that civil society, international organizations, try and get such women, religious women, to become more of an ally. We really do need to provide capacity building for them because they have voice and their voices are influential at the community level. You want to change the way the community perceives the participation of women in security or peace processes, we can go through these women. So that's what one of the things that we've been doing. Second slide, the next slide, please. And the second thing that we thought was crucial for continuity is to make sure that we embed WPS in institutions that are on the ground. And this means looking at the role of the education sector. We have developed a diploma program on women, peace, and security. The Mindanao State University has been offering it. We've had our first cohort of graduates. We're now on our second year. And I am here in a province in Luzon because this university that I'm in now, the Nueva Ecija University for Science and Technology, has signed an MOU with us. They want to replicate, which means in the north, there's now going to be a university that will offer a diploma program on women, peace, and security, but their focus is not going to be Muslim secession or Muslim issues. Their focus is going to be the CPP, NPA, NDF, and the indigenous sector and non-traditional threats. So these are two things that we've been working on, which we think we really need to invest in if we want WPS to be truly implemented and becomes part of the policy and the programs of our countries. And I think I will end with that. Thank you.
So can we have our last presenter, Ms. Sia Pei-Xuan from MSF? Pei-Xuan?
Hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm very happy to be at this panel with amazing WPS colleagues, and particularly you, Sumita, because I think your advancement of gender as national interest pretty much grounds my presentation today. Oh, sorry, I should start sharing my screen. Can you all see it? Yeah. Okay. So today I'm gonna do, there was a lot of zoom in and out, and I'm gonna zoom it back into China in the WPS normative sphere with a focus on its central thesis of development and non-intervention. I think colleagues have laid the ground of regional engagement with the agenda and localization. So for now, I'm going to focus on what is China in this space and what does it mean for the WPS agenda here. Since I took on this topic, the question that I get very, very often is, what is China even doing in WPS? Is it just not there? This is quite understandable because China has no national action plan or any formal, informal institutionalization of the agenda or any intention to do so, to be honest. But this does not mean it's insignificant in the WPS space, as its substantial engagement mostly takes place at multilateral platforms and on normative levels. And China's take on WPS is, of course, not independent of its overall foreign policy objectives. I think here maybe a good way to break this down is to look at WPS in China and then China in WPS. So WPS in China, according to the Georgetown University WPS indexed, it ranks the 87th place of 177 countries studied, and its index number is 0.671. It's not very high. I think the last place, the place before China was Indonesia, perhaps, and the next one is Bhutan. I need to go back and check to check it. And another domestic element is, of course, the training of female peacekeepers. But the number is kind of interesting to unpack because you see this huge gender disparity between female peacekeepers and male peacekeepers. And there are a few emerging feminist IR scholars within China making explicit connections between China's domestic, economic, legal, and political participation of women with WPS implementation. As in, these sort of developments are often branded as this is how China has been implementing WPS. But the question, of course, remains to what extent, because based on the Georgetown indicators, which are inclusion, justice, and security, all three indicators are currently going down in China. But that would not be the focus of today. Today, I think I will really try to dive into China in WPS. And why does it matter? Because China obviously is one of the P5. It sits quite permanently on the UN's still only policy-making body for WPS. And among the P5, it is a top personnel and financial contributor to UN peacekeeping. And more importantly, of course, this then speaks to its ambition to be an important global and regional peace and security actor, if not the most regional peace and security actor. And in this ambition, there's an additional element of being the most important actor with a set of alternative norms and rules it imagines for global governance. And this is the Chinese way. And WPS is not an exception. It is but one exercising ground for its overall pursuits and objectives in pursuing a place in the global political order. And this explains its equivocal take on the WPS agenda. So here, sorry, these two slides, this one and the next one, are going to be a bit texty, but they are a quick summary of China's statements and speeches and responses at the UN Security WPS related events from when WPS was born up till now, so for the past 25 years. And if you will have time to quickly go through it, you can see on participation, prevention, and relief recovery, there is a very pronounced element of how economic development solves the root cause of conflict. And this thesis goes through China's overall WPS deliberations. But here I want to highlight this part. Oh, sorry. Oof. At the annual open debate on WPS in 2022, the Chinese representative for the first time advanced something like women, peace, and development. So this is a pretty subtle but strong reconfiguration of even the name of the agenda, positioning development before security. And of course, other things that are relatively innovative but very close to China's own development thesis is the explicit connection of South-South cooperation, South-North cooperation, and the mobilization of private sector for women's economic empowerment, for conflict prevention. That's how that logic works. And similarly, focus on socioeconomic prescriptions also emerged in the under the relief and recovery pillar. And apart from the four pillars, there are a number of emerging themes that are interconnected to China's more innovative WPS deliberations. And this has to do with its perceived role of the state, of the UN, and of the civil society. And the basic establishment is the sovereignty and self-determination of the state would have to assume a central status for any WPS implementation and practice. And this is to be withheld through non-intervention and a UN centrality that is based on sovereign equality and a limit of check and balance from civil society actors. And here, maybe something very important is China insists that any unilateral WPS-based or WPS-related sanction not to be imposed on state actors. And this, we will go a bit more into details of this later, but this pretty much sets the ground of China's overall take on WPS, which is a theater of overall acceptance, strategic grafting, and partial contestation. So China accepts that WPS as a political agenda to integrate gender into all aspects of conflict and peace is a good thing to have. This brings it reputational benefits. But it specifically tries to connect the agenda with its own pursuit of the development-driven peace thesis. And this constitutes the grafting element. And then, of course, it strongly contends that civil society actors should take a leading role in any normative development or implementation of the WPS agenda. and the agenda stays firmly under the mandate of UN Security Council, but that the Security Council is not Human Rights Council, and women, peace, and security is not a human rights issue. So these reflects its this reflects how WPS is one of the many spaces where China promotes its own agenda instead of genuine gender, peace, and security. And I think the focus today would be what would be the implementations of these overarching theses in China's WPS agency. The first I would like to unpack is the developmentalism thesis. And if we would brand it as China did, women, peace, and development. I think there are some opportunities in idealized situations, because women's economic participation obviously has considerable linkages with participation, prevention, and relief and recovery pillars. These pillars, compared to protection, are perhaps less spotlighted usually, and this provides a counter-narrative of the portrayal of women as passive victims of conflict-related sexual violence under the predominant protection pillar. And I think this also helps to expand what security and what peace, again, connecting to what Tamara and Smita have talked about, human security from a socio-economic security perspective. And the last one, amid the global aid cuts, I think connecting or not connecting, or like focusing on women's social and economic security might provide opportunities, funding opportunities with other development initiatives and efforts. And this has appeared in certain NABs, I think from Nepal and from Nigeria, and the regional NAB from ECOWAS. And it also externally draws attention to how women's participation in conflict prevention might be able to be grounded in long-term and structural reconstruction programs instead of short-term and conflict-focused strategies that usually builds on the exceptionality of the crisis setting. And it also acknowledges that women's participation should not stop at peace negotiation tables, but in the reconstruction with consideration to gendered, social, and economic security. But of course, this should not be embraced without critical examination of other connotations. One of the key problems is this vision of development does not in itself problematize women's participation, and it does not incorporate feminist goals, so to speak. And the first question is, does women's participation just automatically bring genuine decision-making power? I think there's enough empirical study questioning this automatic translation, especially in face of today's rampant global inequality, discriminatory gender norms, pay gaps, double burden of domestic work and labor, and gendered and sexual abuse at workplace and at home. And again, are women allowed to participate everywhere, even in idealized situation? The volatility of post-conflict environments often means lingering restrictive gender codes for women to participate in economic peace-building programs, even when they are in place. And the next question, more importantly, is does this then instrumentalize women's contribution to peacekeeping, to the national productivity and income generation? This this also speaks to the instrumentalist tendency to restrict women's contributions to spheres that are considered natural to their gender. Here, I have a picture of some Chinese female peacekeepers, and a lot of them are working in medical, education, and poverty reduction functions, because in some of the official documents they are considered natural to their gender, these license responsibilities. Sorry, I realize I'm running out of time. And the second thesis is non-intervention. I think in an idealized situation, again, sovereign-based equality is conducive to giving value to every individual state's WPS agency. So an individual WPS experiences and insights, and this could possibly mean that endogenously generated WPS knowledge would be encouraged, and hence implementation of the WPS gender would be more than a one-way street of Western inspired prescriptions. And we have enough, again, empirical studies from the region like Myanmar to see how predefined visions and imaginations of what doing WPS should be like would harm locally grounded realities and would harm eventually the decolonization of the agenda. Sorry, last one. And as many, the challenges would be, as many post-conflict environments can be authoritarian, giving absolute priority to sovereignty or sovereign consent would risk living existing power relations unchallenged, condoning state-led violence, or silencing those most affected in conflict, including human rights defenders, environmental defenders, and not addressing the root causes of militarization. And again, impunity of state actors' accountability in CRSB, and most importantly, limitation on NGOs and CSOs, because China's contention of this UN centrality, or so to speak, UNSC centrality, is still highly state-centric. And this does not sit very well with the WPS genesis from CSO activism. And again, how this would prevent WPS to become a legally binding and human rights grounded paradigm. And lastly, China does not consider itself an environment of active conflict. So it has demonstrated a similar tendency to focus on Africa and Middle East. So the classic wicked problems elsewhere problem. Okay, here are what could be the next for China in the WPS normative sphere.
Sorry, I think we may have to, I'll let you do this very quickly. Can you go through this very quickly?
The key points is this is likely to continue, especially now traditional donors are going through aid cuts for women-focused programs. So China will likely seize this opportunity to rally for its own global governance structures, and WPS is likely to be integrated into its narratives of how, this perhaps represents more of the global South perspectives. Okay, I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Patient. I think what I found most fascinating with the presentation is actually the China's deconstruction of WPS to mean, women, peace, and development, and how that sort of takes it in a different direction. Before I open for Q&A, I just forgot to mention that I think it's important, since we're all interested in WPS, that Amina runs a podcast called She Talks Peace. Is that right, Amina? Is it she? Yeah. And it's awesome for those who are interested. It's a podcast. It's on Spotify. It's on Apple. So, and we've got loads of practitioners and academics and all on it discussing women in peace processes. So just a little bit of information there for you in case you're interested. So we'll take questions now. Let me see. We don't have that much time, we have about 10-15 minutes to take a couple of questions. So just wait for them to just come on. I think we have one. Okay. So this question is for Dr. Basu. Samita, this is for you. Given the intersectional inequalities of caste and religion, especially in India, how might the WPS agenda be adapted to pursue a more inclusive notion of security beyond the category of women? Okay, so that's the question. And the person is asking you this in relation to your work on the security as an emancipation approach, where you discuss the importance of agency and reflexivity. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tamara, and many thanks, Naisha, for your question. I think there is a lot of scope to utilize the current advocacy around gender equality to think in an intersectional manner about questions of justice, access, rights, etc. But at the very outset, I think what I'm trying to get at is that I would be doubtful about the WPS agenda being used to do so. Because as I was mentioning in my presentation as well, and if you follow politics, feminist politics in India, WPS really doesn't come up in popular discourse. The greater chance as far as use of international instruments is concerned, CEDAW, Beijing Platform, etc. are mentioned. As far as conflicts of violence is concerned, then general recommendation number 30 of CEDAW is brought into the discussion. So that's one part that I don't think WPS per se would be utilized, but WPS itself needs to be seen as part of a larger policy framework around gender issues, starting right from UDHR and all the various international policy instruments that have come up since then. As far as so that's about WPS discourse per se, but I think we can have a longer conversation about the need to make conversations around gender equality and sexual minorities be more mindful of the various categories of marginalization that there is in India, including caste-based discrimination and discrimination against sexual minorities as well. So now that's not a great answer, but unfortunately, WPS is not used as much in the Indian case. Thank you.
Thank you, Samita. We have another one for you, but I'll go to Amina first and then come back to you later. So Amina, this question is for you. In the ongoing conflict in the south of Philippines, what are some of the most recent applications of WPS that you found to be the most successful or effective?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the negotiations. When the negotiations were just starting, when Ging Deles was peace advisor, the MILF had an all-male group, not even advisors, no consultants were female, they were all men. But because of the lobbying that was done by civil society, women leaders at the national to local level, and the encouragement of government, the MILF leadership started to see the value of having women, because they also saw across the table what the women at the table were bringing in. And they were bringing concerns about community, about sustainability, education, health, all of that, which used to be absent. And from that time on, I think the MILF has valued the participation of women. So you see it at the community levels. They now have organized the women combatants into their own organization. We hope that this group will grow because it can be a model for other conflict areas and a model for the implementation of WPS. So the role of women in WPS is starting to be embedded. There's still a lot of challenges, but the fact that the autonomous region has a Bangsamoro regional plan of action, I think that's pretty solid in terms of the advance of WPS implementation in areas of conflict. But don't get me started on what could go better, because that's a bigger hole.
Thank you, Amina. The next question is for Patient. So if you could share a bit more examples on the ground of China's approach to women's right-based participation in politics.
As in within China, right?
Yes, within China.
Within China, I think, well, it's put in paper that there has to be a 30% of participation in the political making body, not the top one, but in the structure. But I'm not sure that goal has been met. But I think in recent years, there are some new developments in the particular sphere of gender-based violence. For instance, there was the new anti-domestic violence law coming out from 2017, and that was kind of the first law. Well, you could say it's taken a bit of an essentialist perspective because it was really about of domestic violence conducted from men to women, but call that a baby step. It's better than nothing. And of course, the domestic environment is still not ideal. Not ideal is to say the very least for women's participation, women's rights, women-led activism. But I think on the legal front, there has been some efforts to tap domestic violence, women's protection in marriage, and what was the most recent example? But then if we move away from legal and political to economic, that has been the area where most advancements have been made. Again, if we go back to the Georgetown indicators, I think China is a high achiever in terms of women's education and access to information, access to technology, access to social services. So I think the picture is really a bit largely grey, but somewhat hopeful. It depends on if you're happy with, this instrumentalism of women's economic participation. Yeah, and the other very basics on the legal front. I hope
Sure.
that answers the question.
Thank you. Nurul, I have a question for you actually. So, when I started out, I said, with the pushing, pulling back of inclusivity, inclusive language, even at international organizations, UN included, and with the pulling back, of course, of funding, for certain projects and areas and research. So, what do you think essentially then, when you think in terms of main aim of UN Women, then how does it basically do its job? How can it actually go in and do its job and whether, for WPS? How do you push that agenda forward?
No, I think that is the 1 million question. I think the WPS agenda has been for at least for the last decade or so, been truly a multi-stakeholder sort of responsibility, if you like. And so UN Women's role, has been significant, specific, But really, we are starting to see a lot more movements at the region by women's networks, women's organizations. They are fairly independent. We now have an independent fund, for example, from the UN that only fund women's organizations. Just recently, the Pacific Feminist Fund has been set up that women CSOs can access for the Pacific. And so we're starting to see, I think, and that's the way it should be, a large degree of independence of women's movements and CSOs that are working with government. And the thing about, and looking at Big Sean's presentation, it is correct that it is very much state-led. The agenda was always intended to be a member state responsibility. And the National Action Plan, the emergence of National Action Plans, for example, is actually to underscore the responsibility that you have to include that as, to take it seriously as part of your, and you have to allocate budget to the National Action Plan and take it very seriously. In fact, we are advocating in the latest SG's report that you look at a National Action Plan, not just on the periphery of gender equality, but a strategic blueprint for the countries or the regions' conflict prevention. It's a blueprint for your conflict prevention and peace building work. And so member states, as we move along, and the UN's footprint might be diminishing in some aspects, we do expect member states to take on that responsibility and to provide a lot more support to women's organizations and women's civil society organizations as well. The UN80 reform, as you know, is ongoing, and I just want to say that we do expect coming out of that reform for a stronger, more robust UN women, better resourced. We expect the gender architecture in the UN to be retained and to be strong. But we also expect, of course, that civil society organizations, women's groups, to also be involved in those reform efforts, particularly their take on the gender architecture in the UN system. So thank you very much for that question,
Sure.
Tamara.
Thank you. We have one more question for you, Nurul, in the wake of what you've just said. So we'll just continue with you. So how do you think ASEAN is faring in its implementation of WPS in its national action plans generally, so the member states, compared with other parts of the world? And what are the areas of improvement or ways forward for ASEAN?
Right. And so I think, it has taken 7 years for ASEAN to come up with the regional plan of action. The regional plan of action and sort of the responsibility to implement does lie on the all member states that have more or less, signed up to the regional plan of action. But it may be, and right now what we are trying to do with the ASEAN vision is to make sure that the WPS principles and approaches are integrated throughout the 3 pillars: the socio-economic, the political, security, as well as the economic pillar. And I think that might, improve the approach and the thinking of ASEAN on peace and security, because at the end of the day, the Women, Peace and Security agenda is really about peace and security, right? And should be taken very seriously. It is about peace and security. It's about ending wars, ending conflict. It's about preventing conflict. It's just that it has a different perspective in the sense that, there has to be an inclusive process, a diversity of ideas and voices that goes into that decision-making, and particularly on women's representation. But it moves away from the idea of armed conflict. It goes more towards mediation and political solution, and an inclusive process, basically. And so it is a sort of that alternative to what is happening right now, right? The increase in conflicts and militarization and so on and so forth. It is an alternative. Regarding the national action plans, I mean, I think the regional plan of action has inspired a couple of countries to actually come up with their own national action plan. And what is good about the national action plans that we're still waiting to see, effective and full implementation in many of these countries is the process itself. We carefully monitor the process. The process has to be inclusive. The process has to include diversity of voices and perspective. And it should address and unearth sort of issues that governments are generally quite reluctant to address as well. And in some of these countries, those processes are in place. In others, I think it's still a work in progress. And so we put a lot of value on the process of getting to the National Action Plan. And we encourage member states to, of course, have a good plan to implement the National Action Plan before you even get there. And so I think it's a bit up and down. I would say the progress is inconsistent. On the way forward, budget financing is really, really important. There are very few countries that have a plan to implement the National Action Plan, such as the Philippines, right? The allocation of 5% of GAP and so on and so forth. And so we would expect member states to dig into their national budgets and take on that responsibility of implementing the plan as well. The National Action Plan also needs to be institutionalized, like Amina has said. It has to be part of every agency's work plan. And I think there are opportunities going forward for more inter-regional collaboration, knowledge sharing, and so on and so forth. ASEAN should be part of a larger global community of WPS champions. I think ASEAN is in a really very good place to do that, and not to be pulled back by, a couple of situations and a couple of countries that are not really on board the WPS agenda. So, yeah, I think I'm positive. I am optimistic, and we continue, of course, to work and support ASEAN on women, peace, and security. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you so much, Nurul. And I think we do have a couple more questions, but I think we've passed 3:30. So I think we might have to end the webinar now. So please, I don't know how you're going to do this, but thank you very much, colleagues, for joining us this afternoon and presenting your thoughts and your ideas. I'm very grateful to all of you to have taken the time to come and talk to all of us. So lovely having you here, lovely hosting you, right, on the RSIS webinar series. So we have another webinar on the 30th, and that's going to look at emerging challenges and emerging threats and how WPS is being used to or can be used to address those issues. So with that, and with my thanks, I call the webinar to a close. Thank you very much.